Right, brilliant. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this extremely interesting Fringe meeting on assessment. Firstly, can I thank Edge for hosting this, and particularly for the food. I don't know if anyone's had such good food. Yeah, make sure that we book this one next year as well, because it's exceptional food. I'm Vic Drummond, the MP for the Meon Valley, and I've been working with Edge over about the last year when I wrote a paper on what I consider the future of education. It's on the One Nation website if you're interested. But there is so much we need to do to change it. And if COVID has shown us anything, it is that there are different ways of assessing children and young people. You might not agree with just pure teacher assessment, but we've got loads of other ideas. And we'd really like you to join in the discussions. Once we've heard the panel, I know that you're all here for a reason, so we want to hear what you've got to say. And there are two ways of doing that. You can either put your hand up and speak, or you can do Slido. I don't know how many of you have done Slido before. It's actually very easy. It's called slido.com. Or you can get it, if you've got the conference app, and you go onto this Fringe meeting, press it, and at the bottom it says, I can't remember what it says, but anyway, it says something like, join now at the end. If you press the join now, you should be able to put your questions on there. There we go, and you just type your question in there, and I will try and read those as we go through. So you've got two ways to do it. I can speak in public, and if you do, please don't speak for more than a couple of minutes, because I know there'll be lots of other people that want to speak too. So without further ado, we're going to start off with Rob. I don't think he needs much introduction. He is the chair of the Education Select Committee. He's doing some amazing work, and he agrees with everything I say as well, and I agree with him. So he's particularly useful for me. Right, Rob, forward.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. You're right about the lunch. Thank you to Edge. I'm really pleased to be here. This better not turn into a mutual love-in, but I have huge admiration for Flick, and she's incredibly thoughtful in education, and thank you for all the work that you've done. I've worked with Edge for a number of years now because I'm passionate about the skills and apprenticeships agenda. My first ever speech in Parliament in 2010 was about promoting apprenticeships, and when they invited me, you get invited to a lot of fringes. Edge was the first organisation that I said yes to, and the reason for this is because I think that we need a serious debate about the future of education. And what depresses me sometimes is that people say that after the COVID pandemic that actually what we need is stability, we don't need any changes. And I think that is entirely wrong, because I think we do need a debate. I think the whole, everything that's happened over the past 2 years, which I think was nothing short of a national disaster for our children in terms of lost learning, mental health, safeguarding hazards. And we've got to acknowledge, one, that it was a disaster, but also use the opportunity to have a proper debate about the future of education and what we think our exam and assessment should be. And it shouldn't be closed down by people who just say, no, we can't talk about this. And I'm determined to talk about it and get that debate going. And the crucial question for me in all this is, does our curriculum, does our education system properly prepare us for the world of work? Now, I believe in education. I went to university. My father was an immigrant to this country. He self-made, sent me to a private school, which I was very proud of to do. And sometimes people put it on a picture on my Wikipedia page as if something I'm ashamed of. But funny enough, they put the chapel on there, Highgate School Chapel, which was the only part of the school I never went to, being Jewish. But never mind. But I was proud of that. But I want to extend those opportunities, and I want to make sure that our curriculum better prepares us for the world of work, addresses deep social injustices in education, meets the skills needs of our country, maintains standards, and of course supports the profession, teachers and support staff. And that's really what I wanted to talk to you about today. And first, really, what I want to do is address what I hate is this false debate between knowledge and skills, and it's like a polar opposite. Are you traditionalist or are you progressive, between academic or vocational? I always think that is a false argument, because you can't have one without the other. I had a very interesting debate with Nick Gibb, who I hugely respect, and he did enormous amount of work for literacy and for standards, and I admire him greatly. But I had a big debate with him in my select committee, because I said, and in the articles on a website, a Concerta website, I said to him, if you just learn the names of fish in a river, how does that prepare a Harlow constituent for work? And he replied that it's about cognitive dissonance. Now, I recognise you should learn the names of fish in a river, but my whole belief about the curriculum is it should teach people how to fish as well as learning the names of fish. So this is a false argument. It shouldn't be an argument of knowledge versus no knowledge. It's about knowledge engaged, basically marrying powerful knowledge with skills and attributes needed to apply them in real life. And what we should do is allow the evidence. You know, those who oppose any debate or change to the system always talk about evidence. Well, let's look at the evidence, and the evidence from the current system that we have, I think, is worrying. There are still remains, despite enormous good work the government has done. They all say 1.9 million more children, good or outstanding skills. There's still a downward spiral of English and maths results. And also, we know that the attainment gap between disadvantaged pupils and their better off peers has got worse and stalled. And this isn't just happened because of COVID. It is getting worse. Having gone up, done well a few years after 2010, it's now getting worse or stalling. We know that a third of all students are leaving education without substantive qualifications. Our teachers are stretched, spending hours preparing students for exams, and we know that there is a lot of current dissatisfaction in the current system. Our young people tell us that their education is not preparing pupils them well enough for the real world. On World Youth Skills Day this year, the World Economic Forum heard from young people, and they said, the one thing that would make the biggest difference to me is actually to learn the skills that the job market will require. They want to develop practical skills, such as how to negotiate, write a CV, get a mortgage, basic cooking, how to budget and invest. Now, none of that is woolly. You know, and when you talk about these subjects, sometimes people think I want people who are arguing for a work-based curriculum, that you want everyone in the middle of the room singing Kumbaya. And that is exactly the opposite of everything that I believe in. And there's nothing woolly about that at all. What is woolly about learning about financial education or embedding careers all the way through the curriculum? And if you look at XP School in Doncaster, they're doing this with their students, working on real and practical projects with local employers, developing real and practical skills. And XP schools are rated outstanding by Ofsted. So this is not if it's done properly, it is not a diminution of standards, and that is the crucial point. And by the way, I'm a huge fan of the Michaela School as well, a very different school. I just believe in letting 1,000 flowers bloom and trying different things as long as they are good outcomes. Look at I have the Watchful Eye of the UTC organisation here from Nick Heslop over there. So I just want to look at the success of UTC schools in terms of outcomes, because if you look at the outcomes of UTC students, most students are getting either good jobs, going on to additional education, or doing higher apprentices. And so this a curriculum that prepares pupils for the world of work, in which that a world that we could be, according to some of the big consultancies, that 28% of jobs that are currently done by young people could be lost to automation by 2030. We have to think very, very hard about our education system. The Skills Builder framework frames skills into 8 core areas: listening, speaking, problem solving, creativity, staying positive, aiming high, leadership and teamwork. And these aren't just skills for work and careers, they're skills for life. Now, what I'm arguing for is that for a blended approach between knowledge and skills, and I want more employer-led. I want an employer-led curriculum, because if you agree that the curriculum is about preparing people for the world of work, we then need to make sure that the curriculum reflects what employers need. And I don't like this so-called word soft skills. I think skills are skills are skills, but they want, the surveys show 92% of employers said that they want skills like problem solving, time management, adaptability, oracy are as important as learning numeracy and literacy. And no one believes more in numeracy and literacy than I do. And I absolutely believe in times tables and traditional education. I believe that I'm wary of mobile phones in the daytime. There are a lot of traditionalist methods I agree with, but we have to marry that blend between knowledge and skills. Just look at what the skills gap is costing. It's UK companies, they say it costs a record 6.6 billion a year, and we know that skills are not being prioritised in education policy. So between 2010 and 2018, with the introduction of the EBAC and Progress 8, there was a fall of 154,000, 57% of design and technology GCSEs, and a reduction of 77,000, 20% in entries into creative subjects. And Lord Baker, someone I admire hugely, one of my heroes in education, no kind of left-wing progressive, former Tory Education Secretary, he says, notes that the number of students studying computer science has fallen by 42%. And this is the world we're about to enter, which is going to be one of AI and robotics and automation. And we've allowed a situation where the number of students studying computing has fallen by 42%. Now, that is not some woolly subject or some kind of progressive subject. It's very serious, and we have a deficit in these areas, and we need to make sure, as I say, I keep saying this, that the curriculum prepares pupils for the world of work. And technical and creative skills have been deprioritised in favour of academic subjects. Now, I was very encouraged by the Prime Minister said on Sunday on the Andrew Marr show. He said, when people voted for change in 2019, and I quote, they wanted an end to the broken model of the UK economy that relied on low wages and low skills. It's right that we do everything we can to fix this system to support people to gain those skills. So if that's what the Prime Minister is saying, we will only do that if we change the build a skills and apprenticeship nations. If you just take some other sort of horrific statistics over what's called low skills qualifications, i.e. sort of numeracy and literacy below upper secondary level, the UK ranked 20th out of 32 OECD nations, placed in the UK in the third quartile. At intermediate level, we ranked 25th out of 32 nations. Again, leaving the UK well below OECD and EU averages. And there are other countries are ahead of this. Japan, Slovenia, Switzerland, Poland, Korea, Israel, Australia. The list goes on. And we're the only country where the oldest age group also has higher proficiency in both literacy and numeracy than the youngest age group. We've got 9 million adults in our country without literacy and numeracy skills. I'm hoping that one more minute. All right, I better get on. One more minute. I better get on. So I've given you some of the key statistics. I've told you how we are way behind. So what's the answer to this? Well, GCSEs were introduced, as I mentioned, by Lord Baker. What I would like to see is a change in the system from GCSEs and A-levels. At least have a debate about it, which is to build a international baccalaureate, which includes academic, absolutely traditional education, but also has vocational and technical education as well. And we know that many other countries do it. 154 other countries do it, modern developed countries around the world. It's offered in more than 5,000 schools in 150 countries. So that way we marry knowledge and skills together. We teach people, as I mentioned, how the names of fish, but we teach them how to fish as well. So let's at least have this debate. Let's not try and close it down, which some people want to do. Post-COVID gives us enormous opportunity to transform our education system, have a real debate about what the curriculum is to prepare us for the world of work, and make sure that we have an employer-led education system, so we get young people on that ladder of opportunity right to the top to get the job security and prosperity that they need.
So there are some places for those sitting at the back. Do get a food box, and there's some places here if you want to move now and take a seat, because it's so there's a couple of places here, and if some people could shift up a little bit for our next one. And welcome who've just walked in. There's a lovely food box at the back. I do recommend them, and then try and find a place. Right. Next, we're going to hear from Professor Sarah Jane Blakemore. Sarah Jane is a professor of psychology and cognitive neuroscience from the University of Cambridge, and she's going to share with us some of the research she's done about the link between high-stakes exams and the increased vulnerability to mental health by young people. So, very important area. Thank you, Sarah. Jane.
Thank you. Yes, so I basically agree with Rob. Yeah, okay, fine. I'll stand up and I'll just raise this because my voice doesn't travel very far without a microphone. Can you all hear me well enough? Okay, great. So yeah, I run a lab at the University of Cambridge, and my research focuses on the development of the adolescent brain. For the past 18 years, we've been researching the teenage brain, and today I'm going to talk about why I think there might be a misalignment between what we know about teenage brain development and our assessment system, in particular GCSEs. So adolescence is defined as the period of life between 10 and 24 years. It's a really protracted developmental period in humans, and it's a unique period of biological, social, and psychological development. Now, that's nothing new. You might think, oh yeah, you're just talking about today's adolescence. That's absolutely not the case. If you look back at historical descriptions of this age group, adolescence or youth, you find striking similarities with the way we tend to think about or describe young people today, quite negative, demonizing stereotypes. So, for example, Socrates wrote a lot about youth. He said things like, they have bad manners, contempt for authority, they show disrespect for elders, and love chatter in the place of exercise. And Aristotle as well wrote a lot about youth. He said things like, they're passionate, irascible, apt to be carried away by their impulses. This is the age when people are most devoted to their friends. So there's nothing new about the way we think about this age group. What is new is our understanding of brain development in adolescence. We've only learnt how the brain develops in adolescence over the past 20 years. Before then, we really knew nothing at all, and that's really important because when GCSEs were introduced in the late 1980s, nothing was known about how the human brain develops. In fact, back then it was assumed that the brain stops developing in childhood. That's what I was taught in my undergraduate degree in the mid-90s. Back then, we had no idea how the brain changes during adolescence, but the past 20 years of research has shown that that's absolutely not the case. The brain does not stop developing in childhood. In fact, the brain continues to develop very substantially in a very protracted manner right throughout adolescence and into early adulthood. And we know this because we're able to scan the living human brain using MRI scanning. MRI, as you may know, produces really exquisitely detailed photographs of the living human brain and body. And in the past 2 decades, neuroscientists have used MRI scans to track changes in brain function and brain structure across the lifespan. Now, with MRI, this is a bit of a biology lesson, but don't switch off because this is so fundamental to teenagers, to the teenagers you may have at home or the teenagers you may teach or work with. So MRI allows us to measure various different aspects of brain structure, including how much white matter and how much grey matter the brain contains. And very large-scale studies have shown that both grey matter and white matter undergo really substantial change during adolescence. So first of all, there's a steady increase in white matter across childhood, adolescence, and even into adulthood. White matter contains axons. Axons are the long fibres attached to each neuron in your brain. And those fibres are the fibres along which electrical impulses pass to allow one part of your brain to communicate with the other part of your brain. That's how the brain works. Now, what happens to white matter tracts, as we call them in the brain, is that they steadily increase during childhood and adolescence and early adulthood. And this reflects the fact that during development, axons grow in diameter and they become coated with a fatty white substance called myelin. The reason why I'm telling you this is because both those developmental processes, axonal growth and axonal myelination, increase the speed of neuronal transmission. It makes your brain faster. And that's happening not just in childhood, but also throughout adolescence and early adulthood. Now, at the same time that white matter is increasing, grey matter volume decreases during adolescence. Grey matter contains cell bodies, so neuronal cell bodies, and connections between cells called synapses. In the cortex, that's the surface of your brain, grey matter increases during childhood, it's highest in late childhood, and then it undergoes a really dramatic decline right throughout adolescence, which only stabilizes in the mid-20s, and then it remains stable for many decades. So grey matter volume dramatically decreases during adolescence. Why does this happen? Grey matter decreases partly because white matter increases. Brain tissue becomes more white and less grey, but it's also because of another really important neurodevelopmental process in the way the synapses are reorganized. The process that's happening in adolescence in some parts of the cortex is called synaptic pruning. That is when connections between brain cells are pruned away if they're not being used, and that is happening during adolescence. These neurodevelopmental processes that I've been talking about, so where axons grow, they become myelinated, and synaptic pruning, they are the basis of something you might have heard of called neuroplasticity. That's the ability of the brain to change according to environmental input. In other words, it's the way we learn. That's the biological basis of learning. As such, neuroscientists now consider adolescence to be a period of heightened neuroplasticity, a sensitive period of brain development. Heightened neuroplasticity is good and bad. It confers opportunity for learning information, learning new skills, new competencies, character development through social emotional experiences, learning to work in groups, learning to socialize, but it also confers vulnerability to environmental stress. Now, the back of your brain develops before the front of your brain. That's interesting because the back of your brain contains your visual cortex to allow you to see the world, whereas the front of your brain contains areas like prefrontal cortex. Those are areas that are involved in high-level cognitive functions. So in other words, regions of your brain that are involved in processing high-level cognitive functions are the latest to mature. And indeed, we know from scientific studies that at the same time the brain is developing, so is the mind. Many cognitive processes continue to change during adolescence and improve mostly. These include self-regulation and self-control, decision-making, planning, emotion regulation, working memory, and thinking about the future. And remember, this is partly because the regions of the brain that those processes rely on are undergoing natural development. Experimental studies have also shown that some forms of creative thinking are highest in mid-adolescence, higher than in adulthood, as is exploration of the environment and risk-taking. And one question that I think we really need to ask is whether, in the form they are now, GCSEs, which require learning huge amounts of information, retaining it to be tested on it in a large number of exams, does that really capitalize on this natural propensity for creativity, novelty seeking, and exploration in adolescence? The social mind and the social brain also undergo dramatic change during adolescence. Mentalizing, that's just a jargon word that we use to refer to the ability to understand other people's minds and to take other people's perspectives. That's undergoing improvement during adolescence, as is our self-awareness also developing. So this development of the mind provides adolescents with the cognitive machinery to reflect on themselves, to reflect on other people, to think about their future. It allows them to emerge from adolescence as an independent adult. That's what adolescence is all about. Adolescence is when our self-identity and our character are naturally being formed, and they can and are moulded and sculpted by environmental input. These cognitive developments also, however, place new pressures on the developing individual and make adolescence a period of increased vulnerability to mental illness. And that's where I'm going to finish my talk by saying that most mental illnesses, for example, depression, anxiety, self-harm, eating disorders, first appear before the age of 18. We know that from very large-scale epidemiological studies. Many, time after time, we see that. Anxiety and depression are increasingly prevalent amongst young people in the UK. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has aggravated that trend. And importantly, the peak age of onset of mental health conditions occurs in mid-adolescence, around the age of 15, 16. This coincides with GCSEs, and yet repeated large-scale surveys of young people cite exam stress and fear of academic failure as their most prominent worry. And calls to Childline about exam stress, workload, or fear of failure doubled between 2015 and 2019. So this is a problem that's getting worse, not better. Successive governments have emphasised the urgent need to tackle the mental health crisis in our young people. At the same time, GCSEs have become more linear. There are more exams. But perhaps putting such a large amount of stress on young people at the precise time when the developing brain is particularly susceptible to stress is exacerbating the mental health crisis in young people. Now that we have a much richer understanding of the brain, the mind, and mental health during adolescence, we need to reassess whether high-intensity, high-stakes national exams such as GCSEs are still the optimal way to assess the achievements and the potential of the developing young person. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah Jane. It's really interesting to hear the science behind developing why we shouldn't have GCSEs, so thank you for that. Right, next we've got Johnny Noakes. Johnny is Director of Teaching and Learning at Eton College, and I know we'll have some interesting insights on particularly how boys operate or learn. Probably a better word.
Thank you very much. There are, of course, very good reasons why we have ended up with the exam system we've ended up with. We want to be able to test what pupils know and what they understand in a standardized way to give them a certificate that has some validity that they can take on with them. And it does look in many ways to be the best way to do that. Except that it doesn't do the things it claims to do in any way that's fair. Let me just give you a couple of examples, because I'm only speaking for a couple of minutes here. When I was a head of department at Eton, I had an annual battle with the awarding bodies over the unreliability of marking. We would look at the marks that came back, and sometimes we would just be astonished at the marks that some of the pupils had got. And you can get copies of papers back. We would study them, and we would often say, no, this is just wrong. I would then embark on a process which takes weeks and weeks of getting individual papers back, getting them remarked, and if enough of them are remarked, you get a whole cohort remark, which is free. And at that point, dozens of our boys would get better grades than they got originally. Now, the standard of the marking was generally very poor indeed. We had the time and we had the resources to go through that process to get better grades for our boys. I know a lot of schools don't have that time and don't have those resources. And whenever I hear about the rigor and the reliability of standardized exams like GCSE, I want to say that is really actually not true, and there must be better ways that we can go through that process. Another way, in fact, in which schools, this whole system is unfair, is that in schools, because the school accountability is based on exam grades, and those two really need to be decoupled. understandably, schools will teach to the test. And in particular, they'll take aside pupils who look like they might not get over the crucial hurdle, and they will give them extra tuition. And they'll have less of all the other things that education could be providing them with. And again, at a school like Eton, we don't have to do that. That's another form of inequality that this system is breeding. And these are not nice to haves that they've been taken off. Some of these things that have been taken off are the very things that Rob was talking about as central to what we want our children to learn. Finally, from an Eton perspective, I would say that the big problem for us is not that our boys don't do well in exams, although you shouldn't imagine that they don't feel the pressure and the stress that Sarah Jane's been talking about. You have no idea how stressed some of our boys get about whether or not they're going to get a perfect string of nines, and very high levels of stress. The last point I wanted to go to was this opportunity cost. We have quite a few pupils. Our boys arrive at 13. We have quite a few pupils who are actually already beyond GCSE in their level of education. Not all of them, but quite a few. For the first year, we can do what we want with them. Really interesting, exciting things. And then for 2 years, we effectively have to take them through their paces of GCSE, which is more or less treading water. And I can't tell you how frustrating it is when you have pupils who want to learn and the ability to learn, to force them to tread water for 2 years. That, from my point of view, is an enormous missed opportunity, an opportunity cost. And if we were to have a system whereby schools had more freedom to design curricula that were suitable for their own pupils and forms of assessment that were suitable for their own pupils, that would be enormously helpful for the pupils themselves.
Thank you very much. For those who want to use Slido, I think I gave out the code, so it's #336876. So 336876. So if anyone wants to put questions through slido.com, you can go onto their slido.com website, and that's the code. Right, next we have Phil Avery, who is the Director of Education at Bohan Educational Trust, which has got a number of multi-academies.
The Multi-Academy Trust, yes,
Yeah.
with 8 schools.
8 schools, so
Right, good afternoon. I'm going to make 3, hopefully short, although I'm quite passionate about this area, points. The first is to back up what Sarah Jane said, which is that through lockdown and since we've returned to school, we've been tracking the well-being, the engagement and the motivation of our students. Self-reported tests every 2 weeks. When I say test, I'm talking about just filling in a little quiz online in conjunction with a research partner called Impact Ed. We track them through lockdown, through the first return, back into lockdown, back into the next return. The biggest dips in students' well-being were when they returned to school. And it's not just our trust, this is a national picture. And in particular, they were highest for those students in exam years. So once they had the socialization, they could see their friends, once they were back with the support of teachers, that was when we saw the biggest dip because of what was approaching them and what was more real to them, which were those assessments. So the first point is to back up what you've heard from Sarah Jane. The second point is to say that even if we decide we want to prioritise a relatively unreliable assessment of relatively simplistic application of memorised prescribed information through exams, that actually broadening our assessment system may well be the best way of raising the results further. If you look at the research into EPQs, extended project qualifications at sixth form, those students that do an EPQ do better in their academic subjects because of their enhancement of their self-regulation. In one of our schools, we teach languages at Key Stage 3 through an immersion method, which means that students get 1/3 of their timetable in a foreign language. So our Year 7s who've just turned up in school went to their first tutor time, and it was entirely in Mandarin. They went to PE, which was then entirely in Mandarin. They went to RE, entirely in Mandarin. They may then have gone to history or maths, so it was in English, and then they went to their Mandarin lesson, which was entirely in Mandarin. Those students do better in the subjects where they are taught in Mandarin than students taught that subject in English. The reason is obvious when you watch the classes. Their learning behaviours are so far in advance of their peers because of the challenge, the communication, the collaboration, the creativity they have to bring to bear on that it's no surprise. And then finally, when we look at how we might enhance our academic core through broadening assessment, if we look at things like our outdoor programme, we have an extensive outdoor programme. And students who take the biggest part in our outdoor programme have the highest progress rates. But again, drawing on what Johnny said, that often happens around the side of our timetable rather than at the heart of it. And then my final point is to argue, as Rob said, for this and, not or. But I'm going to add another and in. Skills, yes. Vocational, yes. And motivation. Ilaris Knud's a Danish researcher, and he has a model of learning which has 3 dimensions. Content, Ofsted's focused. Relationships, the heart of any school. But he also has incentive or motivation. And how motivating is our education system for our young people? If we draw upon Dan Pink, he talks about autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Yes, mastery is in every school. But to what extent do our children have access to making decisions about their education, autonomy? To what extent do they have purpose, or as Harvard Flourishing Project talks about, purpose and meaning? There's a couple of blogs on rethinking assessment that are written by my sixth formers, and they talk of wanting to find meaning, interdisciplinary studies where they get to grapple with the big issues of the world. Where is interdisciplinary in our schools? Where is the ability to interact with our local communities, as XP does? It's there, but it's in small pockets. Let's encourage it to be everywhere. So finally, to conclude, we've got education that at the moment is constantly getting us out of date. How many of you would be surprised to learn that the number of people in a low income country is less than 9%, that over 80% of the world's population has access to electricity, and that the average life expectancy of the world is over 70 years. Probably some of those are quite surprising, because you were taught something different. Let's not educate our students for what has already gone to pass. Let's educate our students for what is coming in the future. And in doing so, let's give them motivation, let's give them the skills they need, but also let's give them the well-being they deserve. Thank you.
Alice, who's the CEO of Edge Foundation, and again, thank you very much for sponsoring this.
Pleasure, thank you, and I'm delighted to be following some amazing speakers, particularly Phil, who spoke so passionately there. Government talks a lot about being led by evidence, and yet what we've heard today clearly gives us the structure we need to make this change. We've heard from Sarah Jane about the fact that the way the brain functions, the best way we can measure young people's successes, their creativity, that we are choosing the wrong point. In fact, we are putting pressure on young people just at the point when their brains are developing and they are the most vulnerable. So that is evidence, that is science, that is very difficult to argue with. So if we're going to base this debate on evidence, then let's really listen to the evidence that's available. Let's collate that and let's make a really powerful argument about the fact that we need change. We listened to Rob when he talks about the fact that the debate has been created around this false dichotomy, and we hear it all the time. It's knowledge versus fluffy. It is skills versus academic. It isn't. You know, it's not black and white. Life is not black and white. The grey area in the middle is the really important bit. The fact that we need to be able to give young people access to knowledge. Yes, that's really important. They can access knowledge through Google. They can acquire knowledge. Good. That's really good. But what's really important is how to teach them how to interrogate that knowledge. The world is full of fake news. We are asking young people to be able to navigate through a world that is changing all the time. And yet we're not giving them the skills they need to be able to embark on that journey. Let's really think about what school is there for. School is there as a community feeling, an opportunity, as Sarah Jane said, for young people to be able to decipher who they are, to acquire their place in the world. And yet we're not giving them the tools to do that. Community-connected learning, engagement with local employers, the opportunity to understand their learning in a contextualised form. We're not doing that. And yet there are tiny pockets of brilliance happening all over the UK, in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, in Wales, and here in England. And we're ignoring it. We're oppressing it. Change is difficult. You need to be brave to change. Well, we need some brave people to start talking about this. And we're really lucky to have the support of MPs like Flick Drummond and Rob Halfon, who talk about this all the time. But we need to move this from talking to doing. And so the idea of events like today are to invigorate you guys, to help us to take the debate to the next level. And I hope you don't mind if I'm a bit cheeky and I show you a very short film of the Edge Foundation to encapsulate a little bit of who we are and what we want to do. And if you like what you see, join us on this journey, help us to promote these arguments, and let's move this debate, as I say, from just the chatter to the action. Thank you. I should have clicked the button. Thanks, Al.
Apparently, we are streaming this as well, and they can't hear me, which is probably not a bad thing, actually. Anyway, so we've heard from amazing panelists today, and you're all here because you're obviously interested in education. So this is your turn to shine and ask some of those not too difficult questions, please, but some really good pointed questions. So where should we start? Okay, you need a microphone.
Should be all right without flick.
No, well, no, because the people at home might want to hear as well. Sorry.
Hello, David Gallagher, Chief Executive at NCFE. And I just want to say thank you, Alice, because that video was great. So thank you for sharing and for leading the debate around rethinking assessment, because I think the old adage holds true, doesn't it, that what gets measured gets managed. But in that, it's part of the problem, because actually we should be leading this, not just managing it. So my question is about how we assess. So I'll just tell you very briefly. About a year ago, a provider came to me who dealt with some of the most disadvantaged learners you could imagine, totally disaffected from our traditional education system, delivering some of the most inspiring, engaging, brilliant content we've ever seen. And then she said to me, very to the point, and then they have to sit your boring functional skills test, David, which obviously stung a little bit. But then she told me what she did about it and had recreated that functional skills test as a physical escape room to get learners used to using the skills in a real context that was exciting, it was engaging, it was creative, to give them the confidence to sit the boring test. So the question is, how far should we be pushing the boundaries on how we assess, not just what we assess?
Johnny, do you want to start with that one?
I'll certainly start. I can't hope to finish. There's so much one could say about that. Yes, absolutely, we should be pushing the boundaries. To a large degree, how we assess is determined by the desire to make it as standardized as possible. And of course, for many people, this just doesn't work. It doesn't suit the way they work, the way they think. The fact that I quite like the comparison with musicians, actually. You wouldn't expect a musician to take let's say grade 8, because they happen to have reached a certain age, and that's the age at which you take grade 8. Instead, they would take grade 8 when they're ready to. Now, I know this is problematic in schools to allow everyone to advance at their own rate, but it seems to me that we can go some way towards a more mastery-based form of assessment, where, firstly, schools have more choice over the curriculum they offer. Secondly, pupils have more choice over the route they take through that curriculum. And thirdly, there's more flexibility in how they're assessed and when they're assessed. All those things can happen. They're not easy, but I think we owe it to our young people to make them happen.
Thank you for the question. I think there's quite a lot we can do now, and there's more that we need to get to in the future. But let's look at that idea of a portfolio. That starts to bring together what a student can do at different stages. It starts to get them interacting, having autonomy with what am I going to put in my portfolio, why is it there? It starts to show different methods. It could be written, it could be oral, it could be a project in the local community. So I think portfolio is one way that we can start to really develop a wider suite of assessment. Secondly, I really like the idea of open book. And showing what students can do in that way. The University of Warwick, in one of its subjects, has been experimenting with this at undergraduate level. And they've discovered that their students are far better prepared for masters and are working at a higher academic level if they open up open book tests over a couple of weeks. It's been a revelation to them in certain areas of their curriculum. And then thirdly, and I'm not sure this is proven yet, but it's what can technology do? You know, when I worked at the BBC, I got in through a creativity test. I went to Boots the Chemist head office and went in through collaboration and communication assessments. You know, we've got a PhD researcher who's about to start to look at what AI and machine learning can mine from video journals of students in terms of sentiment analysis and dispositions. So where might that take us in the future?
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great question. I think we need to be radical. And I think the existing system is actually lazy, and I think we should call that out. Just because it's easy doesn't mean it's right. And currently what we have is a system that's homogenous but doesn't actually capture what young people are capable of. And as Rob quite rightly said, this is not about making things easy. This isn't about everybody winning the race and getting a prize. This is really about a deep dive into the individual. You know, are we not interested in shaping the individual and giving the individual an opportunity to thrive? And lastly, I'd say that employers are clamoring for something much more innovative. When you get into the workplace, all your skills that you've used in school, it's quite the opposite in the workplace. You know, it's all about collaboration, working together, presenting to an audience, being engaging, articulating. That isn't what we're asking young people to do in school. So there's so many reasons why we should do this. I cannot think of one reason why we shouldn't.
Just very quickly, and then because I can see some hands going up now.
Thank you. Just very briefly, where I may slightly come over on the traditionalist side of things, I do think there has to be a basic standard of maths and English, because you just can't get on in life, and I think there has to be some kind of standard for that, whether it's functional skills or GCSEs. But having said that, you asked about the how, and I think again a lot of that should be employer-led, because some employers may require different levels of maths or want a different kind of maths qualification. We should make sure there should be a basic level that everybody can do, every student, but beyond that it should be led by employers.
Yeah, I agree with that too, because you can have maths made interesting and English also, depending on what you want to do. Right, now we are getting a bit short of time and then a number of hands going up, so we'll take 3 questions at a time, and we're trying, right, there's 3 there, so why don't we take you 3, and that'd be easier. I'll take you next.
I think I made the cut there. Hi, James Lloyd, Head of Policy and Public Affairs at AQA, the exam board. The largest provider of GCSEs as it happens. So there's an awful lot of interesting points here that I could happily debate for the rest of the day. I mean, I suppose my key reflection in a way is, we've come to an event today about assessment, time for rethink, and I wonder, is it actually a little bit about curriculum and what students end up studying? I mean, there are over 50 different GCSE subjects offered in England, ranging from GCSE dance to GCSE engineering to GCSE electronics. Beyond GCSEs, there are over 1,000 other qualifications that schools can take and will get government funding for if they so choose. Now, of course, we know they don't, because particularly in the mainstream sector, schools have to abide by the rules of accountability measures and EBAC and so forth, and that is ultimately what shapes what students do actually take in the classroom. And I just wonder, through all of this, I mean, let me be clear, AQA doesn't take a position on accountability measures and performance progress aid, and it's probably more than my job's worth to start expressing opinions about this. But I just wonder, is the issue here actually the sort of EBAC and progress aid rather than the qualifications themselves? You talk about different types of assessment, and actually as an assessment provider, let me say that there is an enormous amount of thinking and science that goes into the design of assessments, and the assessments follow the subject content. So, there is plenty of non-exam assessment in GCSE dance. It won't surprise you to learn, for example. And so there's sort of, I will certainly confess that it's slightly frustrating to hear GCSEs portrayed as just being exams, when, I've got teams of colleagues that have to manage tens, hundreds of thousands of pieces of, the moderation of coursework and this sort of thing, who work very hard to do that in a fair and consistent and standardised way. Although, as you say, as acknowledged, Johnny, there are limitations to that process. So if you really get into the detail, there's a whole range of different assessment methods there. But I suppose my central question, and maybe it's a hypothesis, if it wasn't for the accountability measures, would we be having a different conversation? That would be my question. Thank you.
Can you pass it to the two ladies behind you?
Hi, thanks. I'm from the University of Warwick, so thank you for mentioning us. It was a fantastic panel, and thank you to everyone who's said everything. I think with assessment, it needs to kind of replicate a real-world context that people need to engage in tasks. And for me, and this is why exams comes under fire, because retaining, memorising information and then regurgitating it is, in this day and age, is not real at all. But then I do think it is about curriculum, and I think that three things need to happen. Number one, I think there's a real focus on critical thinking, because as Alice said, there's such a wide, we can access any information we want nowadays. We just need to be able to filter that out and make sure we know what information is right. Secondly, I think it needs to be extremely interdisciplinary and very problem-based learning. And then thirdly, I think it does need to engage with employers a lot. My PhD engages with an employer. It's a heritage collaboration between a university and a museum, and that is there entirely to ensure that the people who take that get a job at the end of it. So I think that needs to come through. So really my question is, what is the government going to do in terms of changing that curriculum and setting that pace? Because I think that's where it really needs to come from. So thank you.
Okay. We try and make them really quick questions now. Thank you.
All right, great, thank you. So my name is Gina Cicerone. I'm the co-CEO of the Fair Education Alliance, here with my co-CEO Sam. So what you've said strikes so many chords. We are 250 member organizations. Robert, you mentioned Skills Builder. Phil, you mentioned Impact Ed. Those are some of the charities working with us. We've got businesses and policymakers and education institutions. We agree with what you've said, and I'm curious as to your thoughts. Sarah, building on your point about this being the point where people are really feeling the well-being crisis, how might we achieve more with assessment with doing less? So how can we be creative, do less, rather than putting more pressure on so many different ways and 1,000 flowers blooming?
Perfect question, perfect time. Right, Sarah Jane, you start on.
Well, I'll be brief because I think the others probably can answer all of those questions better than I can. But in a way, I really like that set of questions. Some of the questions answered the other people's questions. So first of all, I completely agree with you. It's not just about assessment. It's also about content curriculum. But I think that's come across a lot in all of our talks. Another thing that Johnny mentioned is individual differences. I didn't mention individual differences in my talk because to do so, it is much more impactful if I can show you a slide of brain development. But I'm not showing any slides today, but I'll try to describe it now. Okay, so we talked about, we know there's huge individual variation in young people. You can also see it in their brain development. So brain development, we work normally in averages. Brain development, if you're looking at, I talked about, grey matter across adolescence goes like that. On average, if you plot the individual data, there is so much individual variation, both in terms of the amount of grey matter, but also how grey matter changes, like when it goes through its most steep decline, when it starts to level out. There's huge individual variation. And it is such a good illustration of how we squeeze out that individual variation in GCSEs by applying this one-size-fits-all system to this massively varied brain development and cognitive development. So finally, I mean, I've got a lot to say, but finally, just to come back to your question about how to some extent, we don't want to lose assessment completely. How best to capitalise upon creativity and to assess things? Well, I mean, there's lots to say, and there's no perfect answer. I think that's what we're seeing in rethinking assessment. But one thing that I feel very sad about is how much practical classes have been squeezed out of the curriculum in order to make way for squeezing as much content as possible into the curriculum and to getting kids and young people to learn as much. Practical classes have been squeezed out. I mean, we see that across the board, but particularly in sciences. And yet we know from neuroscience that the best learning, the most long-term retention of information comes from multimodal learning. That is doing stuff with your hands or being involved, experiencing things, not just reading about it. And the pandemic has made that much worse because the thing that went in the pandemic in, say, science classes was the practicals. And they haven't come back, and I'm very worried that this will be an excuse to get rid of them completely.
Rob,
So, yeah, just going, because we're running out of time, just comment on the...
Apparently we've got to half past,
Okay,
so we can
so,
relax a little bit. I mean,
no.
you might not want to stay till half past, but...
Just to comment on the, I mean, I think the other two questioners know where I am on this. The only thing, sorry, on the exams, I do think we need some exams because I think that discipline of learning and having recall is an important thing, but it shouldn't be the only thing. You need a blended approach, as I was trying to argue in the speech. But in terms of the EBAC, I do not understand, for example, I've got nothing against geography, it's a wonderful subject, but why is geography in the EBAC and not design and technology? I don't get it. And I've argued with DFE ministers about this before. So yes, partly it is due to the EBAC, but my whole framing of the whole argument I was trying to make was actually rather than in the short term you can reform the EBAC perhaps, but in the long term, as I said, I believe you need to rethink the way we do this and have, in my view, an international baccalaureate that children do it, that pupils do at 18. And not have GCSEs when they stay in school right till 18, and then allowed to narrow at the age of 16, as I was allowed to do, and it shouldn't have been allowed. I did history, English, and politics. I should have been forced to do maths and science subjects alongside. And what I want is a much broader, wider education system, as is done, as I tried to point out, in 150 other successful countries.
Phil, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, very briefly, I think this is about assessment. You can't divorce curriculum and assessment, but this is about assessment. This is around the structures that state schools are under in terms of accountability. This is about the options that are open to us, and they are relatively limited. You know, when you look at that real world question, one of the things I would love to see is place-based, local design. Look at the Morecambe Bay curriculum. If you haven't looked at the Morecambe Bay curriculum, that is a curriculum that will be defined in terms of success by how healthy the Morecambe Bay is in terms of environmental health. Now, what a wonderful curriculum. What place does that have currently? Nothing within our state education system, and there are so many opportunities. I'm currently putting together a proposal for what a school focused on the rural and green economy might look like. If it was one of our schools, it would be fantastic. But what's the vehicle for that? Potentially UTC, but what other option? How could we get that accredited? Where is the place of the John Muir Award or the Duke of Edinburgh Award within serious assessment for young people going forward into the next stage of their career? So, some thoughts there.
Okay. All right, Johnny, can I just ask you, why, if your boys are definitely they're above GCSEs, why do you still do them at Eton?
Well, that's a very good question. And in fact, Peter Hyman, who is part of the Rethinking Assessment and an innovative educator, did challenge me on this one point. Not that I would make this decision at Eton, but he did say, look, if you can't do it, who can? Because you've got bright pupils, they're going to do well. You're not worried about the number of pupils that trying to come to your school. Why aren't you being more innovative in this? It's a good challenge. I suppose the first problem is this, parental expectation. You know, that parents send their children to schools for all kinds of reasons, and they want their children to be happy and fulfilled and to be successful in life. They also want qualifications, frankly, because they are the doorway to the next step. And to say to our parents, look, we're actually going to do something really innovative here, which we think is educationally really exciting, they would be with us that far. And if we then said, and your sons will not be getting GCSEs, but don't worry, it's going to be fine, I suspect at that point we wouldn't carry them with us. So part of the problem here is precisely this, that at the moment, what we're really doing is not just seeing what kind of level of educational attainment children have reached. We're creating a passport to the next stage, and that brings in a whole set of different expectations and worries and stresses, actually. So we haven't taken the leap really for that reason.
Okay. Right, some more questions. You had your hand up very at the first. So if we have 1, 2, 3 over here. Yeah, the chap at the back with what he had his hand up right at the very beginning.
Thank you.
And then the lady in grey, because you're close by.
Hi, Phil Hall from AAT, that's the Association of Accounting Technicians. Very much agree with everything that the panel has said. Very quick question, that's how receptive is government actually to any of this? And realistically, when can we expect to see some changes?
Oh, that's a very good question. Rob and I have got our views on that, I'm sure, in a minute. Right, this lady here.
Oh, okay, sorry. Phil Hall from AAT, that's
Sorry.
the Association of Accounting Technicians. Very much agree with everything the panel has said today, but interested to know how receptive government is to this, and realistically, when can we expect to see some change?
Hi, Sinead McBrarty from Education Support. We exist to support the mental health and well-being of everyone working in education. And I suppose just the point to make is we work with hundreds of leaders and thousands of frontline staff, teachers and support staff. And I think what you're talking about speaks to how they want to teach. There's a degree of demoralization in the profession that comes through, and we find it in the calls and the people that we work with and help. I think there's an opportunity to use this agenda to improve retention and to recruit more talent to our schools, because what you're describing is very different from, I think, what somebody might be attracted to in the current sector.
Brilliant. And we'll take one more. That gentleman in the blue. Sorry. Can you reach over? Has anyone on this side got a question for Rob? Because Rob's got to go in about 10 minutes and we'd like to hear his view.
I don't know what is Rob dealing with?
Okay, in a minute. He's the chair of the Education Select Committee. Okay, right, just for, and then we'll have you.
Thank you. My question's actually directed at Rob, if I may, and you as well, please. So Nicholas Heslop from Baker Deering. Lord Baker wouldn't forgive me if I didn't make reference to this today, with an eye on the spending review. And Rob rightly talked about the challenge that we face in getting more young people to pursue technical subjects at GCSE. We need more young people pursuing technical subjects, 11 to 16, which then leads to young people pursuing technical A-levels, B-Techs and T-levels. The problem is the funding that follows the provision of technical subjects. They are more expensive to deliver, particularly engineering, for example, and really what we need to be seeing is some sort of technical subject weighting to 14 to 16 provision that allows the technical subject to be also part of the training bonus scheme. Many thanks.
Right, and if you got specifically for Rob, yeah?
Yes.
Hold on a minute. We just need to get you the microphone because there are people who are listening from home as well. We're streaming this too.
What I see with the educational assessment regime is the cross purposes. Employers wanting one thing, universities wanting another, and it's become a confused picture. And I mean, years ago, I think there was no assessments. Grammar schools did lots of testing, like we've had now.
Quick question, please.
Yeah? Now, if we're going to go down the assessment route, shouldn't we have more diversity in it? Oxford University, for example, used to do stretching A-levels and GCEs. All the assessments done these days are more or less the same. That's the problem. Could there be more diversity, more stretching approaches to assessments.
Okay, we'll start with Rob, particularly about government. Rob, just grab the...
Yeah, on the government thing, I mean, look, there is a debate, a healthy debate in the Conservative Party about this subject, and that's why I want to, these events are incredibly important. I think for those who believe in a change in the agenda, we've got to make sure that when we argue this doesn't mean a diminution of standards. And I think that's what the government is rightly concerned about, because they will argue that since 2010 they've done everything possible to reverse a decline in standards. And you have to deal with the world as it is, as well as the world that you would like it to be. And too often people forget that. And that's why I frame the argument in the way that I do, and focus on outcomes and examples of where this is going on successfully. But having the Prime Minister's former school in favour of part of this agenda, I think helps quite a bit. In terms of funding, well, Nick, you know that you're very well versed in these matters. I think the one encouraging thing, despite the fact we spent 400 billion on COVID and 2.5 trillion in debt, is that the Chancellor, and I spoke to him directly about this yesterday, is massively focused on skills. And he actually believes, and this, that actually the priority now has to be the funding spent on skills, which is hence why we've had the kickstart and the £3,000 going to companies for apprentices. So I think if there is any money left, as the old Labour Chief Secretary said, there's no if there is any left, it is going to be on education. I suspect the majority of it will be spent on skills, and whether it's improving the weighting and FE, I hope it will. We've got the lifetime skills guarantee coming before Parliament, in answer to your question, so yeah, absolutely. I think I'd like to see many more disadvantaged people go to university. Not enough go to Russell Group universities, and when they do, they tend to drop out more. And I think you need to have a completely different, a flexible approach, still maintaining standards, but a flexible approach to try and get more people into, disadvantaged people into university. And I think one of the ways to do that would be degree apprenticeships, where you earn while you learn, there's no debt, you get a skill, you get a job, and there's no worry about the loan that people from disadvantaged backgrounds may face.
Okay. Thanks, Robert. You sneak out. Yeah, I'm going to ask the two teachers to talk about your question about retention.
Yeah, let's talk about what it feels like to be a teacher. And I still do quite a lot of teaching as well as my leadership role. I mean, there are so many often conflicting things that you have to deal with. Firstly, you are, whatever stage of education you're in, you're aiming towards some form of high-stakes test, be that primary or secondary. Secondly, you're worrying about the well-being and the welfare of your students that are in front of you. You also have probably gone into teaching because you have a real burning desire to give those students a meaningful future. And I think at the moment they aren't always aligned. I think that the new Ofsted inspection framework has, although I wouldn't necessarily argue against its focus, what it's done is provide another focal point. We now have accountability measures around league tables, but we now also have a very curriculum-driven inspection regime. The two don't really necessarily work together. Then there's that higher meaning, then there's the well-being and the anxiety piece. So we've actually got to an accountability regime where there are more foci, and therefore as a teacher you have to navigate that as best you can for the best of your students.
Okay, I'm going to ask Johnny in a minute, but I've got a Slido question here, which is really exciting. And it says, do you consider building psychological resilience to be a key skill of the modern workplace? Would teaching the science around mental health empower pupils? There we go, Johnny. You can answer that one.
Absolutely. And
That's from here, by the way.
Oh, that's from you?
I could introduce myself.
Yeah, sorry, Addy.
Hi, sorry, I'm Addy from, I wear two hats, so I'm both a corporate finance director at Sky, and so an employer perspective, we employ 25,000 people across the UK and Ireland. I would assert that building psychological resilience and well-being is a key requirement of the workplace. But my second hat is that I've recently founded an organisation, a new campaign called Teach Mental Health Science, and I would love to know the panel's views on whether the scientific foundations underpinning mental health, if they were taught in a similar way to the way we teach the science of physical health, whether you think that would have a positive impact. Thank you.
Do you teach that at Eton?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. I think it's absolutely crucial that we teach these things. I mean, there's been quite a lot of talk today about the stress of taking exams. And the argument really is we are piling too much stress at a really vulnerable time. But it's also the case that pupils need to learn how to cope with a level of stress because that's life will give them that. So yes, we need to be teaching them how to be psychologically resilient, and we've done some work on this actually at Eton. We have created a course for teaching resilience, which we have tested across state and independent schools. Actually, interestingly, one of the bits of feedback that came back from state school providers was, can you please develop a course not in personal resilience, because our pupils are pretty resilient. Can you develop a course in academic resilience, because that's the area where they have no self-belief. So we have done that, and we're now trying that with Christ the King Sixth Form colleges in London. So we know, Sarah Jane will be able to talk more to the science of this than I can, but what I do know, because I run a Centre for Innovation and Research in Learning, is that we know a lot more about the scientific, we know a lot more about how to teach aspects of resilience and mental health than we knew even 15 or 20 years ago, that we can use in schools.
It's a really good question, and I think in theory being able to teach resilience would be, almost goes without saying, it would be a really good thing. And I know that Ofsted now has a measure of resilience in schools, but the question is from a point of view of people who research resilience, is how are we defining resilience? How is it being measured? What exactly are we trying to teach? It's actually really complex, even amongst researchers who work on resilience. One way of exemplifying that is to tell you about a study that colleagues at Cambridge did a couple of years ago, looking at mental health resilience in a very, very large sample of teenagers. What they found was that a longitudinal study, so following them over years, they found that the young people who were most resilient in sort of mid to late adolescence were the young people who had the highest quality peer relationship with their peers in early adolescence. I'm telling you that because I think that might be more insightful than just trying to teach someone how to be resilient. It's an indirect way of getting at resilience, supporting social and peer relationships, for example. But if there is a way of teaching resilience, then that's the sort of $1 million question, and it should be being done in all schools. I think just at the moment we're not quite there yet in understanding exactly how to teach it and what works best, and that really goes back to what you were saying, Johnny, about individual differences. I think what works for one person might not work for everyone in terms of how they become resilient.
Just like to add on to that, we were tracking, as I said, during lockdown, resilience, well-being, motivation, and there was a significant, and I mean statistically significant, difference for those students that got outdoors and exercised regularly. Based upon that, with all measures being higher, based on that, when we've come back to school, we've put in place interventions. We've got outdoor classrooms in all of our schools. They're currently not being used for general teaching other than 1 or 2 schools. We're pushing through students that are in need of intervention for well-being. And I was talking to a group of students who are school refusers or selective refusers. So they go to some lessons but not others. And they were able to articulate how just a couple of lessons a week in the outdoor classroom, working with trained staff, got them into all of their lessons during the whole week. And so therefore I'm really picking up on this idea there's something in that, but quite how we get to it and quite which direction the causal relationship is going, not so sure.
May I just add something very briefly? So I absolutely agree. If we can do it, it should be right up there. But what is really interesting, and I pick it up off the back of something that Johnny said, is that in the state school, they were saying that what really worried with them was their lack of self-belief in their academic subjects or their academic ability. That, in a nutshell, shows how badly the current system is working, because we are through this system, we are creating a scenario where young people do not believe in their own ability, that we are crushing them just as they're trying to get going. And so, yes, I think it's absolutely necessary, but shall we go back to the problem? Because if we fix the problem at source, then some of these huge pressures on young people will be relieved before they've started.
Okay, now we have some questions. Yeah, here, this gentleman here, and then that's probably it, I think. Yeah.
Hello, thank you. It's a very interesting discussion. My name is Dr. Stephen Curran. I'm Managing Director of AE Tuition and AE Publications Limited. One of the things which concerns me, and I want to ask a question about this, is really, okay, I'm for, developing more skills, breaking up the curriculum more to do all of these things, because I think that's outstanding and good. What concerns me is how you assess things, because, when we look at the current debacle of 40% getting an A, we can see huge problems. The moment you open up different kinds of assessments, you also have problems of moderation. How do you choose, and Johnny, you pointed this out, that you were going back and you had the resources to challenge GCSE. We have enough problems trying to assess GCSEs fairly. How on earth do we do multifarious kinds of assessment and then tell people that this is reliable? Because in the end, if our exam system is going to be robust, how do we tackle this? Because I think this is a question that needs to be asked.
Okay, thank you. And last question.
Hi, I'm Sam Butters, co-CEO of the Fair Education Alliance. So as Gina mentioned, coming at this from the perspective of how rethinking assessment can make things fairer for all young people from all backgrounds. My question is the fact that if we're honest with ourselves, this conversation has been had for many, many years, and it feels like everyone who agrees with the concept, but still nothing's changing. Phil, you mentioned young people doing blogs, sixth form students I think you mentioned. And my question is, why are we not, and how might we, use young people who are either in the current assessment system or have just come out of it, who know what's working well, and I thought your points actually from AQA, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, what is working well for them and what can be improved, and why are we not using those young people who will probably freshen up this debate, and rather than us speculating, it does this to them, it doesn't do this for them, let's involve them, not just in what they think about the system, but their ideas to create a better one as well. And I think there's an absence of that in our current way of working.
Okay, Alice, can I start? Are you actually incorporating young people's views in the work that you're doing?
We are, and I think it's incredibly important. And there's a lot of work going on, not just by us, but a number of other stakeholders that we work with, asking young people about how they feel about this and what they want to do about it. But the trouble is that, as you say, the debate has been going on for a long time, and we are often talking to the converted. And I want to pick up on a question I think that Phil asked, that I think he's left now, which was about, well, here we are having the conversation, but how receptive is government, and when is something going to change? And so from our perspective, it's about how we bring all these stakeholders, all these voices, from young people right the way through the professionals, to those in government, how we bring that conversation together and make it powerful enough to affect this change, because otherwise we're going to continue to talk to the converted, and we're going to continue to have a mass loving, which is amazing, and we love each other, and this is great. But actually, how do we move this debate on? And I think what we've got to do is, I think we've really got to put the pressure on and really call out what is happening at the moment. And that means we have to get brave. And when I say radical, it makes people really alarmed, but we're talking about radical with a small r. What we're saying is that the system isn't working at the moment, and lots of grey-suited people have had a chance, a real good crack at this. It's not working, and the world has moved on. And making education relevant isn't something that would be a nice to have. It's an economic and social imperative, and we really need to, collectively, we need to pull our socks off. Our socks up. It's going to be really tough. It's not going to be easy. Assessment reform is going to be complex. It's going to be difficult, and it's going to cost money. But if we think that young people are our future, which is factually very difficult to argue with, then we really, really need to put that investment in those young people and give them the opportunity to be able to deliver what we all want, because ultimately this world is going to be a very different place for them, and we are not preparing them for that, and that, for me, is a social catastrophe.
Johnny, do you want to?
Yeah, if I could just speak for a moment of this question of how can we be sure that whatever system we put in place is reliable, because it's a really important question, and it is in fact the main stumbling block that alternatives have come across in the past. This does actually relate to the question of how quickly can we see change. I don't think we can expect, especially as we come out of COVID and there's ground to be made up, we can't expect schools to be embracing new systems. This will take time, and one of the purposes of rethinking assessment is to come up with viable alternatives, and we need some time to work those through. But let me give you an example of something which sounded to me to be completely implausible when I first heard it, but it's actually not. And this comes from the States. There's a rather wonderfully named educator called Dr. Looney, who's headmaster of a private school in the States called Hawken. Fed up with having to teach the things that the curriculum required, he came up with an idea, which was that he would teach the things he wanted his pupils to learn, and he would create an online portfolio that allows them to present their achievements in a non-standardized way. This is the crucial bit. Would to present their achievements as assessed by his own school to the universities they want to go to, with evidence and underlying layers if the university wants to have a look at it. So the universities in the States have so many applications to look at, they need to be able to get a glance at what a pupil claims to have achieved, and then they have the opportunity online to dig in. He put this to the universities in the States that were taking his pupils, including Ivy League universities. He said, would you accept this as an alternative to what we currently do? And they said yes, because we want your pupils, and it will give us an opportunity, if we think someone looks interesting, to see what they've actually achieved. In about a year, he had something like 200 other schools on board trying to do this. Now, when I first heard he was putting forward a non-standardized form of assessment, I thought that's preposterous. It's never going to go down. But actually, perhaps, especially with technology allowing us to represent more than some grades, perhaps actually there are opportunities here. I'm not for a moment denying that this system will involve a lot of extra work in some ways, but it frees us up.
Hear to that. So rigorous for what, though? A ranking exercise to get students into university, preparing them for their own future, or a rounded view of the student, a multimodal insight into that person. So I think that's one thing we have to look at. There are many systems out there. Sweden, for example, they announce at relatively short notice where the national exams are going to be, what subjects the national exams are going to be, and the rest is teacher assessed. Everyone's sort of, teacher assessed. But then their inspection regime goes looking at the teacher assessed. And what it does is it says, well, if you teacher assessed your students here, and then in the national exams they were here, let's go and have a look at that and have a conversation about that. It's rounded. It all comes back to the same thing. And in life, what do those grades tell us? So every 2 years, I take a group of students to Greenland. And we trek around Greenland. We do some cultural work, some science work. Those parents have to make a decision on whether or not I'm safe. I'm going to have a pump-action shotgun on the side of my rucksack. I'm taking these students out to Greenland for 3 weeks. They're making a decision. They're not going to look at my grades. My grades are pretty good, but it's not going to give them a clue. So let's, as to whether I'm going to be safe with their child. So let's really think about rigorous for what, and there are lots of different systems out there. And in terms of student voice, absolutely right. There are organisations out there that should be part of this debate. People like Teach the Future, which really speaks to that idea of meaning and purpose. And everything that I've spoken about today has come from really in-depth research of our students, far beyond anything that we've done before, and much of it with university researchers, but also just those cafe conversations, talking to them. I was talking to them about this. I'm going to go and say this. What do you think? And Mary would look at me and go, no. And that conversation about rural and green school, that absolutely comes from them. There's a group of students in a part of our multi-academy trust where they want something different. They deserve something different if they're going to go on and have that meaningful, purposeful, motivational future that will, if they're motivated, get them the skills and the academic qualifications they need.
And the last word goes to Sarah Jane.
All I wanted to say is that, yes, I really agree with involving students in this kind of decision-making and development of a curriculum and assessment, and in our studies, which is slightly different, we often involve young people themselves in the design of our studies and interpretation of the data. Why do we do that? Well, partly because they have much better insight in what's going on in their own minds than we do, but also because, as I said in my talk, they often provide the most creative ideas and the most creative ways to interpret data, giving us new ideas for new experiments. So yes, getting young people involved is really critical.
So I think all that ends for me to do is to thank all my panellists. So absolutely brilliant, and it's been really thought-provoking. I know that you can approach any of them if you want more information on what they've said, because as you can tell, they're passionate about what they do and they're very knowledgeable as well. And if you want to help us do it, do write to the government or the ministers or whatever, and we do need to keep that pressure up. We've got new Secretary of State, we've got new ministers. They're much more engaging than the last lot. And dare I say it? For instance, the morning after Nadeem had got the Secretary of State, at 7:15 in the morning, he was on his WhatsApp, and I said to him, I've written a report last year, do you want to see it? He said, yes, please. It was with him by 7:20 in the morning. That's the sort of person he is. He's very, very good at listening to people, but now is the time to do that. So please, if you've got any research or anything, about this, because we've all know, and we all come here because we're so passionate about it, please let him know, write to the Department of Education, badger him as much as possible. The more young voices we can get would be really helpful as well. But it's that mental health bit that really got me last year when I was trying to find some evidence as to why we should change things. And talking to the Children's Commissioner, who's also on board as well, do speak to her. She's fantastic. She's got a huge amount of knowledge and experience as well. So between us all, we can do it. It's not going to be overnight, and we have to put things into place to change it. It is curriculum and assessment going side by side all the way, but it can be done, and we do need it. But thank you so much for your time today, and particularly to the panellists. Thank you so much.